3 years ago, I concluded a very impactful academic research study where I answered the question, how did Cowessess First Nation develop and implement its Mio-Pima-Tiswin Act to retake control over its children? I found that years after the implementation of the Act, not a single Cowessess child was apprehended and placed into government child welfare. I had the opportunity to disseminate my research to thousands of people all over Canada and beyond. Amazing research is being conducted by racialized faculty and graduate students all over Canada in fields from biology to psychology, from public policy to public health, from research in film to research in education. Racialized researchers are doing amazing work to solve real-life problems. And now they're here to share it with you in very simple terms. My name is Kwaku Ayisi, and this is Academic Research Made Simple. Welcome everyone to the Academic Research Made Simple podcast, or ARMS. My name is Kwaku Ayisi. I am a PhD candidate at the Johnson Shayama Graduate School of Public Policy at the University of Regina. Incredible research is being conducted all over Canada, from British Columbia all the way to Nova Scotia, by racialized graduate students and racialized faculty. And today we have as a guest on the podcast Siham Hagi Hussein to join us and share her research with us. Siham is a first-year doctoral student in the Experimental and Applied Psychology program at the University of Regina, working under the supervision of Dr. Sarah Zanetti. Siham recently completed her MSc in Experimental and Applied Psychology under the supervision of Dr. Zanetti, which was supported by a Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council Canada Graduate Scholarship Masters Award. Siham also received the Canadian Psychological Association Certificate of Academic Excellence for her master's thesis and undergraduate honors thesis. In her research, Siham examines 1. Racial biases in adults' judgments of Black and white children's reports. 2. How various forms of prejudicial attitudes predict adults' judgments of Black and white children's statements. And 3. Contextual factors that may influence adults' propensity to label Black children as liars. In general, Siham's research interests lay within forensic and developmental psychology, with a specific focus on children, deception, detection, and prejudice. Siham is also heavily involved in student-led initiatives at the University of Regina, such as the Advocacy, Learning and Inclusion Group for Next Generation Psychologists, or ALIGN, and the BIPOC Graduate Students Association. Welcome to the ARMS podcast series, Siham.
Thank you for having me, Kwaku.
Good to have you. So, Siham, can you tell us a bit about the pathway to you becoming a PhD candidate in psychology specifically, or even generally?
Yeah, I think my journey started off really early in undergrad, I think as most undergraduate students do. Entering the university, not really knowing what I wanted to do. I had a few options. I was thinking medicine or other professional programs. And then I took, in my second year, I took a developmental psychology course with Dr. Catherine Robinson. And that's when I started to fall in love with developmental psychology. And speaking to her and other graduate students in the program, I decided to try volunteering in a research lab. And it was with Dr. Kayla Brewer, who studies children in the criminal justice system. And so I began volunteering in her lab as a second-year undergraduate student, and I really fell in love with that. Mm-hmm. And then I decided to apply for the honors program in psychology, and I got matched with my current supervisor, Dr. Sarah Zanetti. And so that was my first time actually getting to have some input into research. And so I did the literature review alongside her. I did the actual study with her, analyzed the results, wrote it up. And that's when I started to realize that I wanted to continue to do this and solve those problems. And so here I am now as a PhD student.
Wonderful, wonderful. And can you also tell us a bit about, for those who are not very familiar with the field of psychology, or what sort of research is being conducted there, can you tell us a bit about that field and maybe some of the different research that is being conducted either within the University of Regina or just generally?
Yeah, so psychology broadly is the study of human behavior. And within psychology, there are a lot of different areas. And even at the University of Regina, there are a lot of different areas of psychology that are being examined. So there's cognitive psychology, there's neuropsychology, there's health psych research, developmental, of course, and forensic psychology, social psychology. So there's a lot of different branches. Specifically at the U of R, we have a more younger forensic psychology department. I wouldn't call it a department, but an area of research. And so that includes my supervisor, Dr. Sarah Zanetti, Dr. Kayla Brewer, who I've already spoken about, and Dr. Susan Yamamoto. And within forensic psychology, we do a lot of different things. So there's jury research, for example. Within my lab and Kayla's lab, we do a lot of investigation with children in the law. So that's kind of what's going on here. But across Canada, there's a lot of other stuff going on as well. So a lot of people do police research, like use of force, stuff like that, juvenile delinquents. So and a lot of areas are intersecting as well, especially with law.
You mentioned jury research. Can you elaborate just a bit on what that could look like?
Yeah, so one of my close friends and peers, like Katie McDonald, does jury research with Susan Yamamoto here. And she looks at juror decision making, so different factors that might influence juries when they're making decisions on whether or not to convict an individual. So factors such as someone's race or their gender, their mental state when they committed a crime, stuff like that. And so it's really cool research, and it's pretty extensive right now. Yeah.
Okay. Interesting. Okay, so now let's move into your specific research. What is your research topic, and how would you describe it to a non-technical audience who might not know what some components or elements of it might mean?
Yeah. So I focus on deception detection, or lie detection, and basically how adults determine whether or not a child is lying or telling the truth. So in my undergraduate and master's research, the scenario was a child at school who broke a laptop or is suspected to have broken a laptop. And when the teacher interviews them, the child says, "No, I didn't do it." And so then we asked participants, do you believe the child is lying or telling the truth? And within that, we manipulated things such as the gender or race of the child to see if people's responses differed based on those variables. So in short, I guess my research kind of looks at, and the long-term implications are, when a child is giving testimony in court, what are factors that would make someone more or less likely to believe them. So right now we're kind of doing the more seminal research because it's an area that hasn't really been explored too much. But further down the line, we want to look at, more extreme cases like juvenile delinquents and children who are victims of crimes committed by adults, and whether, when they're giving testimony in court, what are factors that, influence adults' likelihood of believing them.
When you say seminal research, can you explain what that is?
Yeah, so it's kind of, right now, it's one of the first studies that has been done investigating this topic.
Okay.
So right now we're kind of trying to build the foundation so that we can explore more extensive cases later on.
Okay. Interesting. And what was your motivator, or what inspired you to want to study this specific topic?
Yeah, so this was actually a topic that was brought to me by my supervisor when I met with her to do my honors research. But this is an area that I've been wanting to do for a long time, since I started doing research with Dr. Kayla Brewer, because she examines factors that relate to like credibility with like eyewitnesses, children who like witness crimes. And, while I was volunteering in her lab, I always had those questions of, what if it was a Black child, just because of my personal experiences growing up Black in Saskatchewan. And so those were things that were kind of in the back of my mind. And so when my supervisor brought it up to me as a potential research idea, it really fit, and it made me really excited to want to do it.
Okay. So Siham, can you tell us a bit more about the main issue or the main problem that you identified in your research? A bit more. You talked about lying lying detection among children, but can you explain a bit more about the main problem that you're trying to research?
Yeah. So the overall problem is that Black people are overrepresented in the criminal justice system. And so what we're trying to understand is why that is. And so what we are doing with this research is understanding the things that happen early on in life that create this pipeline for overrepresentation in the legal system. And so one thing that came up in the literature that kind of motivated this was that, these negative experiences that happen in school with Black children, make them more likely to want to drop out of school. And, they disengage. And when they do that, they become involved in criminal activity, which eventually leads them, to prison. And so we're trying to understand, why these negative experiences happen in school. Is it because adults don't believe them? When children report cases of like peer victimization, for example, are they less likely to be believed? Are they more likely to be accused of doing something that they actually didn't? Because that can have negative impacts on, things like self-esteem, and even wanting to go to school. And so that's kind of what we're trying to understand. And then hopefully the long-term implications to that is understanding why there's this overrepresentation, and then we can hopefully try to do things to try to mitigate that.
Okay. And the scope of your research, is it Saskatchewan? Is it broader?
Yeah, so for my honors and for my master's research, we actually used an American sample. And we did that for a few reasons. One is because it is one of the first studies examining racial bias in adults, judgments of children's lives. And so we kind of wanted to get a more broad understanding from American samples, because, race relations are different there. And especially given this time, I think people are just so polarized with these topics. And so we kind of wanted to understand what was happening in the States. And for my dissertation research, I want to focus more on the Canadian context. But doing this research first in the United States kind of helped us understand just factors that are more prevalent there. And for my dissertation, I kind of want to compare and contrast, just again because race relations are different here because of historical context and differences. But yeah, so for my dissertation, hopefully we'll be using a more Canadian sample.
Okay, a Canadian sample. Okay. So regarding the findings in literature, you talked a bit about that. But can you share a bit more about some of the findings regarding this particular topic in another jurisdiction, or maybe a different form of the topic, but still speaking to what you're trying to research and find more about?
Yeah. So regarding background information of the topic. So deception detection research is actually quite extensive. Like, it's been happening for a very long time now, and there's researchers all over the world that do deception detection research. Specifically with children, previous research has found that adults, well, in general, adults are really bad at detecting lies. The likelihood of adults, correctly detecting someone's lie is only 50%. So that's like flipping a coin. And so when adults are detecting children's lies, most often than not, they will judge the child as telling the truth. And this is because of a few different reasons. One of them is because of adults' just general perceptions of kids and thinking that they aren't cognitively able to come up with lies. And so generally, adults will show this. We call it a truth bias towards children when they're detecting their lies. So more often than not, they'll judge that a child is telling the truth. And so this is kind of what guided this research was, okay, so adults tend to assume a child is telling the truth, but how does this differ based on the race of the child? And no research has done that. And so this is kind of one of the first studies to examine that. And we found that adults, well, in my honors research, we examined different scenarios. So for my honors research, we found that adults, judge Black children to be telling the truth, generally most of the time. But then for white children, we found that it was still at that 50-50 level. So some participants judged them as telling the truth and others judged them as telling a lie. And so we saw that, Black children were being judged more favorably compared to white children. But this is because of adults not wanting to appear prejudiced. So we use the scale to measure adults' desires to, appear prejudiced. And so we found that their judgments for Black children in this scenario were guided by, their personal reasons and social reasons to not appear prejudiced. And we found differing results for my master's research. We found that, and consistent with previous research, that adults judge both Black and white children as being truthful. And so this wasn't groundbreaking by any means, but we used another prejudicial attitude scale. So we measured adults, general Black attitudes, and then we also measured their color blindness racial attitudes. So people that, say that they don't see color, for example. So that's what the color blindness racial attitudes measure was measuring. And we found that people who held more greater prejudicial attitudes were less likely to judge Black children as telling the truth. And so for my master's and my undergraduate research, these were different studies that have been done before. Across the world, though, a lot of the research on deception detection and children look at things like, when a child is giving testimony in court, different factors that influence their, perceptions of credibility, but also adults' ability to judge when they're lying and telling the truth. Things like, when children have accents, for example, stuff like that.
Okay. Interesting. Can you emphasize for us the research questions for your PhD dissertation specifically?
Yeah, so I'm in the early stages of my dissertation. And so I do have a few different studies outlined. Nothing is really solidified just yet. But something I want to look at for my dissertation is how the findings I found in my honors and my master's research vary depending on the context. So, a child doing a minor misbehavior in school, like knocking over a garbage can and lying about it, for example, versus a child vandalizing, like a principal's car or something more extreme. So we want to see how adults vary in their judgments in those 2 or 3 or 4, I haven't really decided yet, scenarios. And the idea behind this is because research has found that adults tend to view Black children as more inherently criminal. And so the reasoning behind this study is I was like, oh, maybe if a child is accused of doing something more criminal, adults might think oh, then I think the child did it because, they're Black and they're inherently criminal. And so that kind of is guiding my first study. And for my second study, I wanted to see how the findings I found previously apply when a child is a victim. So when a child is accusing an adult of abuse, for example, are they more or less likely to be believed because of their race?
Okay. What is your methodology or your anticipated methodology for answering those research questions?
Yeah, I think I'm probably going to do what I've done in the past and use transcripts. The only different thing here is for, my study for child victims, I think I'm going to try to find real court transcripts to give to participants to read over and judge that way. But typically in the past, we, create these fake transcripts and these scenarios with dialogue going back and forth between a child and a teacher. Participants read that, and then they'll fill out this. They'll make their veracity judgment. So, is the child lying or telling the truth? And then at the end of that, they'll typically do questionnaires assessing different things. So, different types of prejudicial attitude measures. We've done a political ideology scale, stuff like that. So we're probably going to stick to the same methodology for my dissertation research.
Okay. You mentioned earlier that you were in the early stages of your research, but just curious, are there any findings so far, or it's too early for that?
I haven't started anything. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So I'm in the early stages. I'm only in the second semester now of my first year of my PhD. So my focus right now is just conducting my literature review to guide my methods. And then I hope to defend my proposal next fall term. And then at that point, I'll be able to collect data.
Okay. Okay. So, Siham, what are some of the limitations that you've identified so far? I mean, it's possible there aren't any since you're at the beginning stages, but are there some that you've identified or that you anticipate might be limitations to your research?
Yeah, I've definitely identified a few so far. I think one major issue in this line of research that a lot of researchers are experiencing right now is the fact that these are fake scenarios. So adults are, reporting on these fake scenarios, but does this really translate to real life? And so that's kind of where the big gap is so we're identifying all these things that are coming up when we do these studies, but then in real life, we're seeing a different reaction. So, for example, when I mentioned my master's research and my undergraduate honors research, we saw that, Black children were being rated as more truthful and more favorable compared to white kids, but that's in contrast to what's happening in the real world. Black children are more disadvantaged than white children. And so there are a lot of things we can do to mitigate these issues. We've used a social desirability scale to see if people are reporting based on, wanting to appear more favorable and less racist. So we've used these scales, and we see that people report this way because they don't want to appear to be racist. But it's really hard when we get results like that to try to apply it to the real world because we're seeing such stark differences. So that's one main issue. Another issue that we've identified is, again, very similar. People are doing these studies online, and so there isn't that much pressure to make a correct judgment because there aren't any implications for making a wrong judgment. So, for example, in the real world, like if you're on a jury and you accidentally, convict someone who's innocent, you might feel that guilt. There are negative implications to making incorrect judgments in real life, as opposed to when you're doing this study online and it's a false scenario. And so that pressure isn't there. And so that is also guiding people's judgments.
Okay. Now, my next question, you've explained it in different ways, but I'm just going to ask it in a different form. Why does this research matter? How can you explain to people why this matters?
Yeah, I think it matters for a few reasons. Like I said before, this is an understudied area. And I think it's important to understand these factors that impact, the lives of Black children and the Black community in general. So like I said before, Black people in Canada and in the U.S. are overrepresented in the criminal justice system. And so it's important to understand factors that influence this so that we can try to mitigate these issues. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. That's I agree that those are very, very good reasons. The next question you can answer either on a personal level or on a general level. As a racialized researcher, are there any barriers to success or opportunities to success that you've either experienced or have seen?
Yeah, I think as a racialized researcher, there are a lot of barriers. I think in general within academia, there are a lot of barriers, and it becomes more difficult to succeed as a Black and racialized researcher. Going back to my undergrad, it was really difficult to even get into a research lab. I remember being in my second year, emailing professors asking if there were any volunteer opportunities in their research lab. And it is really difficult unless you personally know someone and have those connections. I was only really able to begin my research journey and volunteer in a research lab because I knew someone who was already in that lab. And so that barrier is there, and I think it becomes more difficult as someone is more, minoritized. So if they are an international student, for example, and don't have many connections within the city or the University of Regina community, it could be more difficult for them to even get those opportunities and get their foot in the door in the first place. It is really nice, though. I think people are starting to make strides towards EDI and being more inclusive. There are more scholarships available now for racialized researchers. Not at the university, well, not just at the university, but, in other funding areas. And so that is really nice. I think it's creating more opportunity for racialized researchers and trying to make academia more equitable, because Black people are severely underrepresented in academia. And so I think these movements are definitely more inspiring, and it's nice to see. But even despite that, I see a lot of barriers. Just because I think also being racialized, I think that also overlaps with a lot of other things. We see a lot of racialized students having to work more. And so it becomes more difficult, balancing school and work and then volunteering in a research lab, because that's a privilege, to work for free. Not a lot of people can do that. And so, yeah, I think it's there's a little bit of both. What's nice here at the University of Regina, though, is I think there is a really nice community of racialized students. There are groups like Align, for example, in the BIPOC Graduate Students Association, which foster a better sense of community and a space for students to feel like they belong. And I see that, it's a common thing across Canada now at universities where racialized students are coming together. And I think we are seeing a lot more opportunity than there have been in the past few years. Yeah.
Okay. Wonderful. Thanks for sharing that. My next question has to do with open research. The Government of Canada is committed to making federally funded science open by helping to generate research ideas, making data and publications readily available, and making research understandable and useful. What are your thoughts on open science?
I think open science is great. A lot of journals and funding agencies are requiring people to be more transparent with their research practices, which I think is really great. And not just within psychology, but within a lot of other areas, there's a replication crisis. And we've learned a lot about this in my previous courses, but, studies not being reproducible or replicable.
Right.
Yeah. So, the open science movement is great. And it's something that, personally, I've started to implement and my lab has started to implement in our research practices, like pre-registering your studies, posting your stats and, your code for your data analysis so that, people can replicate it. I think it's a really great opportunity to learn too. When other researchers are posting their their code for, their stats, I think it's a great way to, use that and implement it in your own research. Overall, I think open science is great.
Mm-hmm. Great. For your research, are there, and if there are, what are some of the opportunities to conduct further research as an extension to yours, which maybe you might decide to after your PhD, or even other future researchers might decide to build upon or extend, or study a different aspect of your research? Are there any opportunities like that?
I think there are a lot of opportunities. Just even between my supervisor and I and our conversations, there's so many different things we still have yet to examine. And I definitely will continue to examine different parts of my research, beyond my dissertation, just because there's so much to do. One thing in particular that I'm not doing in my dissertation, but I'd like to do in the future is a similar study using a mock jury. So having participants come in and, reading this case as if they're an actual jury. And then at the end, having to actually convict someone for, a crime or something. Just so we can better reflect what actually happens in the real world. That's something that, would take a lot of time. And so that's not something I'll be examining for my dissertation, but I think it's also an area that is worthwhile exploring.
Okay. How important is it to disseminate your research to a broader audience? And have you had any opportunities to do that?
I think it's really important because if, we're not disseminating this research, then what's the point of doing it? So in my lab personally, we're still at the very early stages. I've disseminated my work at conferences, in front of an academic audience. But I think the next stages are, sharing these results with educators, people who work with children, police officers, for example. I think that those are the next steps.
Okay. Are there any people that have inspired you through your academic journey to becoming a PhD student and possibly even further, that you would like to acknowledge or talk about?
Yeah. Well, firstly, for sure, my supervisor, Dr. Sarah Zanetti, has definitely inspired me. She came into the university when I was applying for my honor, so I didn't really know much about her. But, just during the 4 years we've already worked together, she just inspires me to want to do better and do more. She also just has such great work ethic, which I think is really inspiring and motivating. So definitely my supervisor. There are a lot of different faculty at the University of Regina too that inspire not just this research, but me as an aspiring academic. For example, Dr. Catherine Robinson, who I mentioned before, she really inspired me to want to research developmental psychology and work in academia. I took her developmental course when I was in my second year of undergrad, and I think she's one of the best lecturers I've ever got to witness. She is so passionate about the topic, and yeah, she was just a great source of inspiration for me when I was in my undergrad. Another person is definitely Dr. Susan Yamamoto, who I also mentioned before, who studies jury research as well. And she's a racialized faculty member at the University of Regina as well. And so we've kind of connected there, just both being racialized. And so she definitely is a source of inspiration as well.
Okay.
Yeah.
Wonderful. I think you are doing incredibly important work, and just like you've had people to inspire you, I'm sure you've inspired people in the past and you'll continue to inspire people. Do you have any message for anybody who might be thinking of conducting research on a PhD level or just academic research generally? Do you have any advice for them?
Yeah. I think what I would tell my younger self is, to keep pushing. Academia can be really hard. And, there are a lot of hurdles you'll have to face, but I think you kind of just have to see the light at the end of the tunnel and pick a research area that, you actually are passionate about, because that'll be a really great driving force for you when things become difficult. And I think that's something that has really pushed me throughout the past couple years. Academia, again, can be really, really challenging. But there are so many other great things that come with it as well. I was able to travel a lot during my master's for conferences, and that's something that I probably wouldn't have been able to do if I wasn't doing research. And so that was really great. And, you meet a lot of great people. There are times where you have to sit down and focus and you read a lot and you write a lot, but I think you kind of just have to view it as something you get to do. You have the privilege to do and not something you have to do, because you don't have to. If you do it and you decide that, it's not for you, that's okay. But there are times where, you love it and it can be difficult, but I think viewing it as something that, you have the privilege to do can really drive you.
Great. Well, Siham, it's been great chatting with you about your research and hearing all the wonderful work that you've been doing. Thanks for joining us on the ARMS podcast.
Thanks again, Kwaku. This was really fun.
Thank you. Thank you once again for joining us on the ARMS podcast. Please tune in again to hear more amazing research being conducted by racialized faculty and racialized graduate students.